Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I am looking forward to opening up this episode. Today I'm breaking open a little bit more of what I see as a development of the Catholic Psych model, a sort of fleshing out on a deeper level of what we've been working on and how it interacts with some really good research and a little bit of a groundbreaking movement in the field of psychology in general. There's been sort of a shift over the last 15, 20 years and moving much more into a more holistic understanding of the person, even in secular psychology. So it's really fascinating that what's happening in secular psychology is in a way catching up to what we already know with Catholic anthropology, but we're so far ahead. We're so far ahead when we have the blueprint of the human person. But we do want to bring in that research and understand what's going on in the sort of contemporary secular world as well. So we've been learning a lot, developing a lot, and going further with everything that we're talking about. And so you've already heard me mentioning some of these things on the podcast. So today's episode, I'm going to really unpack what I've been talking about when we're talking about different parts work, parts theory. There's some cool systems called internal family systems. It's a newer kind of theory of psychology. And we're going to talk about how this really integrates with the Catholic anthropology, what this has to do with mindfulness, what this has to do with some of the things we've already grounded ourselves and founded ourselves on in terms of what it is to be healthy, how this interacts with our spiritual life, and how we can become the best version of ourselves. So sit tight, stay tuned. After the intro music, we'll get right into it. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast. All right, so we have been talking a lot about parts and thinking about what this has to do with how to be the best version of ourselves. And I think it's really helpful to go back a minute to where I started with Catholic mindfulness. You know, it's really interesting. There's some criticism. There was some criticism, at least, when I first came out with Catholic mindfulness, because it has Buddhist roots. And in terms of the manifestation of what we talk about mindfulness today, you know, mindfulness is thrown around all the time. You've certainly heard the phrase before, and it's become really popularized. Over the last 40 years, there's a lot of research that has developed around mindfulness, and it went from being a treatment protocol in hospital settings to picked up by Oprah and, Deepak Chopra and everybody else that, has something to say about self-help and pop psychology. And now it's obviously everywhere, right? When you see it on the magazine cover in the grocery aisle, for the, Time's special issue, you know that it's hip pop culture. And so what is mindfulness? Let's start there. Really briefly, mindfulness is simply paying attention to the present moment. But it started as a therapeutic intervention, a protocol. It started by a guy named Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed it in 1979, who was Buddhist. He had been practicing his own, in his own life, Buddhism, and realized that some of the things he learned about the way the mind works through that Buddhist lens, he thought could be really helpful for his patients that he worked at. He was at UMass Medical Center and had a chronic pain unit. So he worked with patients who had suffered chronic pain, which is terrible, terrible suffering. These were patients that were addicted to narcotics medication, like really severe addiction to their pain medication. But there's no other choice because eventually that medication doesn't really work very well because of developing tolerance to it, and the pain can become unbearable. So he developed a protocol that is an 8-week program to teach his patients how to practice mindfulness, because essentially by paying attention to the present moment, by learning how the mind works and learning how to turn off the fight or flight sympathetic nervous response, or at least reduce it, it would decrease the experience of pain. And it actually became more effective than medication. And so over time, that was 1979. So over the last 40 years, so much research, thousands of research studies have been completed to show how effective this perspective of the mind is, and knowing how to be sort of in control of the way that we're thinking and then what we're doing to our bodies through our thoughts. So it was that experience from Kabat-Zinn who was realizing the mind-body connection, even though it's coming from a Buddhist worldview, but he saw the mind-body connection, which was really groundbreaking for science to go that deep and that far into affecting the body through the mind. Okay, now that's huge. That's really important. Now, again, Catholic anthropology, we're 2,000 years ahead, so we already know the mind-body connection. We know the spirit-mind-body connection. We know that we're plugged into an objective truth with a God who created us, who's an actual agent of change, who is actually personal and involved in our life and gives us the grace to become who he created us to become. So we're light years ahead, right? Okay. But when secular science starts to open up to realities that are true about the human person, it's really important to benefit from that research, even though we can add to it, correct it, criticize it, critique it, revise it. But they're doing really good work. And my argument was that the Buddhists who don't have God in their worldview only have themselves to sort of analyze and understand. So you have an entire worldview, an entire cultural worldview and philosophical sort of cultural mindset that only has the human person to think about. And when you compare that to Christianity, we want to understand ourselves, but we have much more beautiful things to be sort of pulled towards. And ultimately, we have to kind of come back to realize that we are beautiful too. But we have Jesus Christ revealing himself, and that can become more of an emphasis, maybe rightly so. But then we also want to come back and look at the human person. So St. Augustine is one of my favorite saints, in his prayer to know God and to know ourself. Those are the two things that we want to understand. Well, the Buddhists don't have God to spend any time with, so they're only looking at themselves. And in many ways, maybe they understand the way the mind works, the way that the human part works better than we do, which is, just on the practical level, not the worldview level, but in terms of what is a rumination? What is happening with the sympathetic nervous response? Why am I sticking to these thoughts? What happens when I turn towards the five senses in the present moment? What happens to the stickiness of fear or different elements of anxiety, depression, things like that? And there's some really interesting insights that come from that worldview. What's the problem, though? The problem is they don't believe in the reality of the self. And I've got some videos also on YouTube where I talk about, the problems with Buddhism, why philosophically there's not an alignment with our worldview. And all of that is well and good. And that's why I discuss how Catholic mindfulness is actually very Catholic, and it needs to be distinguished from Buddhist mindfulness. So it's not the mindfulness that's wrong. The mindfulness is neutral. It's like breathing. But in a blog article I wrote, I used the analogy of drinking tea. People say that there are maybe a Buddhist tea ceremony that has certain dimensions of spirituality that is maybe or worldview philosophy that's different from what we would believe in. We would think that their worldview is wrong. But it's not the tea that's the problem. It's the worldview behind the ceremony of drinking the tea. So we can drink tea and we can praise God for the glory of the way he made the tea and the way that it's good to nourish the body and all the other things. Well, mindfulness is like the tea. So we can say that the mindfulness is good, but we want to go deeper to say, why is the Buddhism wrong and why is the Catholicism right? Okay, and then this isn't to put anybody down. This isn't to say anything negative about any Buddhist person, but it's a worldview that we can discuss and critique. And in Buddhism, they don't believe in the self. They don't believe in differentiation between being at all. And in fact, enlightenment and truth is that all is one. All is one. Which means that there's an illusion of distinctions, an illusion of multiplicity in being. So that means like me being different from you being different from the car you're in, or the headphones you're listening to, or whatever it is, that's all an illusion. That at the end of the day, true enlightenment is when you can get your mind to experience the unity of all being. And ultimately, there's no such thing as God, and there's no such thing as self, because all being, all that is just simply one. Now, the interesting thing is there is a truth to the fact that there is a unity to all being. And in my video on YouTube, I talk about the mystery of God, in that he is a Trinity. He is three and one. And then also the mystery of creation. So that all that is created in his image, out of him, to varying degrees. Ultimately, the human person is the fullest image of God. But there's God participating in some way and spilling out of himself and becoming imprinted in some way in all of being. So all of being carries the mark of God. And especially in the human person, we are made directly in the image of God. So the mystery of God's Trinitarian dimension of three and one is also going to be imprinted in all of being. So when it comes to the Buddhist perspective, they see the oneness of God. They don't call it God because that would be separate from them and God even. But what we would say is there is oneness in God, and there's oneness in all of reality. And at the same time, we carry the mystery of bringing both of these ideas together, the oneness and the multiplicity, the one and the three. Buddhists, they don't allow for the mystery. They come up with an answer. In some ways, Buddhism or this, enlightenment and the Eightfold Path and all this stuff, you have to become some kind of Zen master. It seems like that's super esoteric and difficult. And we have all these movies, these kung fu movies or whatever. And, you have to go into the cave and you stay there until you reach enlightenment. And it seems so sort of spiritual and everything else. But really at the end of the day, it's actually less spiritual. It's less mysterious than our Christian faith. In Buddhism, it's very simple. They just don't accept the mystery of both unity and multiplicity. They say, well, yes, it looks like there's multiplicity, but that's an illusion. So we're going to cut that out of reality. We're going to say, whatever you think you see when you see diversity in being, you think you're separate from another person, you think you're separate, there's this God out there and there's you here. No, that's just not true. It's just an illusion. The only thing that's real is the unity of all being. Interesting. And then, so the self doesn't exist in the Buddhist worldview. So we are looking at what they learned about the mind, but then we're correcting the worldview. And so we're going to take that. And that's what I've done with Catholic mindfulness. I've created the system of understanding. This is what is true about the mind that the Buddhists came up with. And we can learn from, and we've tested, and it's been researched thoroughly. It's one of the most validated and most thoroughly researched medical protocols available. And it's used in every medical program, every hospital, every psychiatric hospital, every program of psychology. There's no question. Mindfulness works. It's a good thing. The question is, why does it work? And then how much of that Buddhist worldview comes into it when it's being taught. And that's why I created Catholic mindfulness, because I want to take what's good and cut out what's bad and then bring in even more of what's good. Because if it's working, there's a reason. It's built somehow into our psyche that God created. And so then I realized that this fits in with abandonment to divine providence. which is a whole spirituality which brings peace. And it makes sense that spiritual peace and psychological peace can go hand in hand, and that we can seek after both together. And it's pretty complicated. Sometimes there are biological issues that get in the way. Sometimes there are real diagnoses of different things. So it's not so simple, but this episode is not about that. We're going to just set the groundwork now for where we're going next. And where we're going next is to say, what else is there? So the Buddhists say the self doesn't exist, but they're really insightful about the mind. I want to bring in another dimension of our humanity and the oneness and the multiplicity of God, the diversity of God. So God is 3 and 1. He's not just one, like the Buddhists think. He's 3 and 1. So how does that threeness of God show up in our world? There's many, many, many ways. I talked about this in other places, but I in one place I used the example. When we're just considering humanity, humanity has a singularity to it. It's a oneness. There's a unity of humanity. And if we all get to where we're supposed to go eventually, there's a communion of saints, right? A unity. And yet at the same time, we really do believe in ourselves as separate. We are each individual. We're unique. We're unrepeatable. So there's a very real ontological, philosophical reality to the individuality of each one of us. That's multiplicity. So within humanity itself, we have a unity and a multiplicity. But what about in each one of us? If you take one person separately, and we look at the person and we say, how is this person made in the image of God, who is 3 and 1? How is one person made in the image of God who is 3 and 1? And we typically, psychologically, think about the person as only unity. We have only this mono-mind perspective, except for a very interesting occurrence that we know from psychology, which is a diagnosis, a psychological experience that used to be known as multiple personality disorder. Now it's called dissociative identity disorder. But this is really interesting. So we have, and think about that, even that transition of terminology and the diagnosis from multiple personality to dissociative identity. Even in that terminology, it's like we're moving away from an idea of multiplicity towards an idea of unity, even in that disorder. But it's very clear with that disorder that there are crystallized multiple experiences of different versions of a person's self. And so a person can appear to be different kinds of people or different people altogether. And we have these ideas of ego states, of alter egos, of multiple personalities. Now we're saying that, now that the science of the diagnostic manual, the terminology or whatever, which, I have issues with from previous episodes, but that now they're saying like, now you're disassociated from yourself. So you're moving away from yourself and you're going into these other identities, but it's still like trying to reference back to the unity instead of the multiplicity. But let's look at this for a minute, because what we find here in somebody with multiple personality disorder is something that resonates with what we all experience from time to time, and maybe even on a daily basis. How many times have you thought to yourself, who am I? What is going on in me right now? Or even like St. Paul, why do I do the things I hate? And I can't do the things I want to do. There are so many ways that we each experience how we act differently from day to day. And it's not just acting. If we really think about it, if we really look inside, we can see that we have different alter egos, different kinds of ego states, different kinds of manifestations of ourself. And what we see then in something like multiple personality disorder is when there's a severe trauma, when there's those kinds of difficult life experiences, especially early on in life, those alter egos, those ego states can become very polarized and very cemented. And it becomes a protective factor. It becomes a coping mechanism to go all the way into another one of those ego states and stay there and close the door to seeing the other ego states that were there and how there may be multiple ego states. You see, for a healthy person who hasn't been traumatized in that kind of way, we can have within us all these different ego states, but we're aware of it. The walls between those ego states have not been built all the way up to the ceiling. So it's more like the dividers in like an old office building, where you see like cubicles, but you still see over the wall, you could still see over the divider. So there might be some compartmentalization of different egos, but depending on more or less of the trauma that's occurred, you have higher or lower walls between those different states. So when it goes all the way out to the extreme with some severe trauma, when somebody's been really deeply wounded, and it actually serves them to be able to hide out in one of those other compartments, they build the walls all the way to the ceiling, almost, and they get to the point where they almost don't even realize that there's anybody else here. When you go inside that little cubicle, it seems like it's just you, and you're the only one here. But then when you have less trauma or you have more integration of your life, you get to integrate all these different parts. Those walls are a lot lower. And so you can see across and you see everybody else in the room. And we want to be able to look at this and say, okay, so what does this tell us about ourselves? And how does this match up with how God made us? So we still have a unity of our identity. There's still a oneness to who I am. There's a oneness to who you are. But there's also, in some way, a multiplicity of who you are. And does this seem so far-fetched? Can't it not make sense that if we're made in the image of God, who is both three and one, then there is this unity and multiplicity of our very personhood? Now, again, it doesn't mean we're actually multiple persons. The personhood is one. But we can also find a reflection of God's Trinitarian life within ourselves and these different parts that make us up. So here I am today just introducing this concept. And then I also want to introduce the system of psychology that is taking this idea and really going farther with it. But I also want to be very careful because just like Buddhism, this other system is off the mark in some very significant ways. As significant as Buddhism is wrong about the existence of God, so too does this new system miss the mark about the existence of God. And actually, where Buddhism says that the self doesn't exist, this new system claims that the self is actually the only thing that really exists. It's the only thing that really matters. So that's what we're going to polarize these two against each other and then see how Catholic anthropology puts us right down the middle, and it holds both systems together with that complexity and even that mystery. So the new system is called internal family systems, and this has to do with what they consider parts work. And the whole system is built on getting to know these individual parts. And this is really, really important. There's a movie that was made with an internal family systems consultant. And the movie, which you've probably heard of and most likely have seen if you have kids especially, is called Inside Out. And I recommend you watching this movie, Inside Out. It was made from a perspective of internal family systems with an IFS consultant. And we have the main character, but we see into her head. It's a little girl who we see into her head, and there's little characters that are at the control center of what's going on inside of her head and managing how she feels and how she perceives things and how she responds to things. And that's basically the gist of what parts work is getting at. And I'm not going to get into all of it right now. We can talk about this again in another episode. But basically the gist of it is all the parts matter. All the parts are good. And the only way to really have freedom is to really get to the root of what is happening with our parts. So I wanted to start off with just a justification for why this matters, why it's good, and why it can make sense from a Catholic lens. We have parts within us. Even if we're not traumatized or experiencing these alter egos to such a crystallized and cemented way, we all do have different parts within us. The therapeutic model that helps people find real freedom in their life is based on looking at those parts with compassion. And so what we end up getting to is this reality that we, made in the image of God, both in his unity and in his multiplicity, are good. We are good. We are created in love. We are loved into being. And so many people of faith especially believe that God loves us. We might say the Divine Mercy chaplet. We might have a devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. We might talk about God's love. We can read the Gospel of John, the letters of John. We can be filled with God's love in all these ways. But yet, there are so many parts of ourselves that we hate, that we don't love, that we don't have compassion for. And the key here to unlocking our greatest fulfillment and flourishing that's possible is to receive all of God's love that he has for us. God enters into our life and loves every part of us, even the parts that we don't like about ourselves. And this is a lot to unpack, and we can keep on unpacking this, but what we want to look at here is how the part of us that gives rise to behaviors that we don't like is not bad. This is the profound insight from this system of internal family systems, this modality. Thoughts and feelings and behaviors are not the same as parts that give rise to them. So you might have a part inside of you that is really assertive and takes charge. And if that part of you, if you've been wounded in some way, then that part of you might step up to the plate and might start acting in a very protective manner because of how you've been wounded. So let's say you've been wounded by a parent growing up, or a neighborhood bully, or some other situation, and you were in a trusting disposition. You're an innocent child. You're just sort of wide-eyed and looking for the world to take care of you because that's how we're born. And then all of a sudden you get wounded, and you have this part in you. And it might not have emerged even fully yet, but this innate part of being assertive, this capacity for taking charge, for being a leader, for having a perspective where you can see what to do and go in the right place to do it. But that part is going to come and rise to the challenge and show up to protect you, because that part is also going to be able to get aggressive. And that part might be able to mirror some of the bullying that it watched others do. And then that part might say, oh no, I am not going to be a victim again. If it's either bully or be bullied, I'm going to start to bully now. And now that part starts acting out of that wound to protect you by bullying other people. Now, we might grow up in that way, and then we realize we have this bully part inside of us, and the whole point is, most of the time when we see that stuff, when we hear about like not being sinful, and we want to become better, we want to become virtuous, we want to be holy, and we look inside ourselves and we're like, I have this bully part of me. The temptation is to say, I got to get rid of this bully part. But what we don't realize is it's not a bully part. It's a good part of us that's acting in a bullying way. And if we go after a part of ourselves, trying to push it out, reject it, ignore it, shut it down, then we might have some temporary success, but it's going to come back. So what ends up happening is we have all these different parts inside of us in conflict with each other. I know I'm supposed to take charge right now. I need to give an attitude. I need to fight for justice. This happens all the time when it's like some slight of injustice with, you're at the restaurant and, something gets messed up, or, maybe you're dealing with a contractor, something around the house, and somebody takes advantage of you, or something doesn't go the right way, or whatever it is. And we have these voices that erupt inside of us. Dealing with kids, this happens all the time. This is like the daily struggle with kids. Am I supposed to be implementing the rules, or am I supposed to be giving compassion and mercy? Do I let this go, or do I double down and make it really clear who's in charge, because it's for their good and they need to learn how to follow rules? Like all these parts inside of us battling it out. Well, when we think we just have to figure out who's right and who's wrong, the part that gets judged as wrong might shut down for a little while, but it's going to come back. It's going to come back because the part is actually good. And the part has something good to say. Even if it's saying something that we don't like and we want to correct its behavior, we don't want to reject the part. And so next week, the next episode that I'm going to release is an interview with another Catholic psychologist who's done a ton more work in bringing in this model of internal family systems with Catholicism. And I interviewed him, Dr. Peter Malinowski, and we talked a lot about this. And then actually we also do a bit of an exercise, and we talk about my parts. But I wanted to give this episode to introduce this concept and get this out there, because what we're doing here is taking what we learned in Catholic mindfulness about how to have interior peace, how to have interior silence, how to become more self-aware of what is going on inside of us. But this is the next development of that, where we're saying, what do we do with all the stuff that we found? What do we do with those narratives, with those thought patterns, with these ideas that we have about ourselves, about other people? Why are we nagged by these same critical thoughts about ourselves? Why are we fighting against these lustful thoughts, or these angry thoughts, or these jealous thoughts? Why are these things plaguing us and coming back over and over and over again? Of course, we're always going to be plagued by something, but we can do a lot more to actually untangle what these knots are. We have to do more than just pray to Our Lady Undoer of Knots. We can actually go in to what's happening in our interior life and start to do our part to untangle these threads. That's what we're doing here. So we're going in, we're looking at what we found with interior awareness, and now we're going to start to understand the psychological dimension of what is coming up within our psyche, what is coming up within our own view when we look inside of ourselves. So I hope that this has blessed you. I hope it has raised a lot of questions for you. I love to raise questions, and I want to hear your questions. Please, please, please email me your questions. Go to the YouTube channel, Catholic Psych Institute. On this video, put the questions in the comment box. wherever you find us, Instagram, Catholic Psych on Instagram, DM me questions. I want to know your questions. As this opens up your different thoughts and feelings about whatever it is that I'm triggering or putting a finger on, I want to know your questions because this is how we can continue to unpack this. And then stay tuned for the next episode. I have an awesome interview with Dr. Peter Malinowski, and then we do some personal work, a little bit of an exercise, a meditation that he leads and I follow, and then open up a little bit more about some of the things that I find within myself. All right. God bless you. Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.